semester. We were thinking about how to best commemorate this. We did a showing of Goodbye Lenin on Sunday. But I can't think of a better speaker really to bring in and have someone take stock really of what it's been like for Eastern Europe since the wall came down. And it seems like Dr. Wood, every time I check Facebook, has been somewhere in Europe. Just recently returned from Krakow, right? From
Prague.
So who better to sort of give us a feel for what's happening on the ground and what's been accomplished, some of the challenge these countries have faced in the last 25 years. Dr. Nathan Wood, Department of History.
Thanks. Well, when I was abroad and I saw on Facebook all the publicity for this event, it made me really nervous because I don't feel that I'm an authority on this topic. I give consistently in Bart's classes a lecture that's, I'm going to plunder from that lecture today, not see these slides. And yeah, I mean, I've been going to East Central Europe, Poland in particular, for the last 25 years now, just about 24. I was in high school, I was a senior in high school when the Berlin Wall fell. It was a major event for me. I followed it with rapt attention on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. And I'm sure that some of you may have actually been there or had a chance to go there. I don't have that experience. But I went to Central and Eastern Europe shortly thereafter in the summer of 1991. I went as a missionary for my church, and the day that I found out I was going to Poland, the day that the envelope came in the mail telling me where I was headed, was also the day that the National Geographic arrived. And on the cover of that National Geographic, some of you may even remember, was I think two soot-covered children whose the whites of their eyes and the whites of their teeth was just about all that stood out in this bleak, black industrial landscape. And it was all about the environmental destruction in East Central Europe under years of state socialism and the sort of infamous Black Triangle region of sort of Moravia and Silesia and in southern eastern Germany. So it was with mixed feelings that I went to Poland in the summer of 1991. Excited to be in a place that I knew so much history was occurring and things were changing so quickly. Slightly worried about my health. Before I start, though, I'd like to just announce something absolutely terrific. My predecessor, whose shoes I will absolutely never feel, Anna Cięciała, has just been awarded the Komandoria, or Polish Cross, from the Polish consulate. This award was given to her in absentia and she was received by someone who gave a great talk here just last year, Neil Peace, whom we invited as a Backus lecturer. So some of you may remember Professor Peace's talk here, and so he accepted the award in her place. And I just found out about this 20 minutes ago, and I'm really, really excited to share the good news. All right, so let's talk a bit about what's happened in these last 25 years. And we can start by looking at a cartoon from the very early 1990s by one of my favorite Polish cartoonists. His name is Andrzej Mleczko. He's a big burly guy who chooses to shave his head bald and wear a beard. He's got one green eye, one brown eye. Very sort of iconoclastic sort of fellow, and he has a gallery in Krakow and a gallery in Warsaw where he sells his cartoons. Some of them are quite ribald. I'm not sharing any of those with you today. But this is Mleczko's take sort of on this kind of early moment. And because this is a brown bag, I'd like to open it up to you. Just what do you make of this cartoon, of this illustration? Sorry?
Frying pan to the fire.
Frying pan to the fire, exactly. So stepping from the maws of one system into another, right? Anything else?
The dogs are dropping.
Yeah, so I mean, you've got these birds, carrion crows, waiting for the spoils. This sort of suggestion that Poland here, this sort of middle-aged, gray, balding figure, is stepping from one system to another, and and there's something waiting for the leftovers. And I just draw your attention to how he's dressed, right? This is a trope that cartoonists use to depict state socialism. Gray and patches, right? This idea that you've got to sort of make do with what you've got. Maybe I'm going the wrong way. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, so The Fall of the Wall. Here are two cartoons that very deliberately hearken to this shift. Here is, well, Marx, right? And now he's playing a very different sort of role. Hey, proletarian, buy this brick for cheap. Das Kapital is going to be an excellent doorstop now that systems are changing. And here by Zbigniew Żomietzki, you see in German, proletarians of all countries unite. So the most famous line from Marx and Engels' 1848 Communist Manifesto. Now the implications are slightly different though, right? So what seems to be going on in this image here?
The proletarians of East and West Berlin are uniting.
Yeah, but it's kind of unidirectional, right?
Yeah.
And in West Berlin are the symbols, Bayer and Mercedes, of sort of global and German capitalism. Oh, I keep pushing the wrong button. Maybe I'm holding it upside down. All right. And this was, of course, an era of tremendous hope and belief in the potential of the future. You know, if in the West, particularly in the United States, was reason for chest thumping and triumphalism, this idea of winning the Cold War, that's certainly not what the dissidents who had been fighting through the 70s and the 80s had in mind. And this is a moment that I find so poignant. So this is in Prague. This is campaign posters for Havel. Václav Havel, Havel nach Rad, Havel to the castle being the seat of sort of power there in Prague. And then here someone has written Ano Vigne and no one else. So, and then Podpisy pro Václava Havla, so signatures for Havel. And this is so beautifully democratic. You get the idea that citizens walking by could literally sign their name and suggest that they were in support of Havel's candidacy for president. And then you see his campaign slogan. First of all, he looks very different, right? He doesn't look like a typical politician. He's just in a sweater with the collar kind of in a slovenly way sort of jutting out. And he's just smiling and gesticulating. He's got the Civic Forum button on his sweater. And then his lineup here is truth and love must triumph over lies and hatred. So there was so much reason for optimism, and I was swept up in that optimism as a young, as I say, senior in high school and then starting in college. The high school that I attended was a state magnet school, and I still am amazed that my professor of history, Terry Jones, organized a class about the fall of communism for the spring of 1990. He cobbled it together over winter break and offered it to us, and I eagerly signed up and took it. And of course our sources were Economist articles and Newsweek articles and whatever he could muster up to help us understand what had just happened in the year before. And so it was very exciting for me to go to Eastern Europe. In 1995, I went to Prague for the first time, and I picked up some materials related to Václav Havel, and I wrote my senior thesis about Havel's presidential speeches. And so I certainly was enamored of this possibility for a new way of thinking about the world and a new kind of politician. And at that time, there were lots of debates in the New York Review of Books. Timothy Garton Ash, among others, some of you may recognize the name, a professor at Oxford, who sort of made a career out of reporting the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, sort of debating with Havel on the pages of the New York Review of Books, is there a place for the intellectual in politics? And Havel adamantly saying that there was, and Garton Ash being skeptical that there was. So here's a moment where there's great possibility, great potential. People peacefully, for the most part, overthrew state socialism in Eastern Europe. And what would happen? What would be the possibilities? What would come from this? So one of the issues was the market, capitalism. So here is a cartoon from the early 90s, I think 1990 or 91, that shows sort of Alicia in the land of socialism and Alicia in the land of capitalism. And when I lived in Poland in the early 90s, these open-air markets were everywhere, the bazaar, where people would just peddle whatever they could, sell things on tables. And at this point, it's not really clear which Alicia is better off, necessarily. I mean, there's something empowering about her being a woman in the workforce, in a sort of a typically gendered male sort of job in the land of socialism. And here it says, here cheaper. So this sort of, the slogans of capitalism are already catching on, but people are just trying to make sense of this rapidly changing world by selling, tchotchkes and kitsch and bras and tennis shoes from China at these open air markets. Here are some more mleczka. So it says, I've got Whiskas, now I just need to buy a cat. So this young man is so enamored of the new commercials and advertising from the West that he goes out and buys cat food and doesn't yet have a cat. And then here's another mleczko. And just think that for 200 years our family never allowed itself to be Russified. And the little boy is eating a hot dog, and there's a hamburger stand behind him, and he's wearing a cowboy hat. And so there's this sense that American-style capitalism was taking sway. There's no doubt that in this period there was a tremendous desire to return to Europe. I mean, the whole idea of Central Europe, perhaps made most famous by Milan Kundera's essay on Central Europe in 1984, was this idea that Central Europeans wanted to assert that they were very much part of European civilization, and that the Iron Curtain had unnaturally bifurcated Europe and had kept them separate. And so there's this dream in this moment when the wall falls that now they too can be part of European civilization and recognized as such, as having being an integral part of Europe. So this is hearkening, of course, to the myth, right, of Europa, the sort of the founding myth of Europe, where Zeus seduces this princess to climb on his back as a bull and then crosses to the mainland. And here's a pole, a barefoot pole, just hearkening to the barefoot nobility idea, just holding on by the tail, just trying to become part of Europe. And then here's another cartoon which says, I don't have to make it to Europe, but I've absolutely got to get out of Asia. And the implication is that life under state socialism, under Soviet dominion, was a condition of Asiatic backwardness. And that the Poles, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Slovaks, everyone is facing squarely to the West and asserting their belonging to Europe. And then the question is, of course, will they be accepted? Will they become part of this Europe? And you recall, of course, 91 to 93 is also when all of these expansions and debates and votes about creating the European Union are occurring. So what does it mean for these sort of the little stepbrothers and sisters of Europe? Is there going to be a place for them in Europe? So this is just a map to remind us of where the Iron Curtain was. So we have several questions that arise from 1989. What does this mean? And when does the big transition really happen? And I think in some places, Romania, for example, it's more like 1996 when the communists are really sort of weakened significantly. In Slovakia, it's 99 when Mečiar is finally out of power. And in Serbia, 2001. But there's this moment when you have a shift to more democratic governments and a rejection of the state socialism. But the question is, what is this transition to? Is it merely a victory of the market, the sort of the free market model or of capitalism? Is this the end of history? Certainly there are plenty of wags in the West, Huntington and others, who sort of saw the collapse of communism as so beyond the pale, so hard to fathom that this must mean that we're in this new historical period. And they started writing about this idea of the end of history. And as I say, for Central Europeans, this was all about a return to Europe. And this occasioned, I think, what you might call some rather strange historical metaphors. This idea that East Central European history had been on ice or had been derailed. You see these metaphors, they're quite replete among East Central European intellectuals. That Havel uses these metaphors, that communism came in and interrupted or froze or diverted the trajectory that our history would have taken. And of course that denies their own history, their last 40 years of history under state socialism. And what's really interesting when you think about Havel's speeches, when he came to the US Congress and he was much ballyhooed by both sides of the aisle, he was very playful in using Marxist metaphors in his speech, sort of reappropriating and somehow rejecting these metaphors. But when you study Havel's rhetoric, it's undeniable that he grew up under state socialism. And so I find these metaphors troubling. To suggest that one's history is diverted or on ice or frozen is to deny one's own history. So one of the questions is, would there be an opportunity to reappropriate the history of state socialism? And the answer is, I think that there is now. Now when you go to the bookstores in Prague or Krakow, there's always lots of books on the life, sort of everyday life under state socialism. The PRL is what these books all have as their code in the title, the People's Republic of Poland. And there's great interest in this. And the East Germans have coined a term for this, Ostalgie, right? This idea of nostalgia for the East, or nostalgia for life under state socialism. It doesn't mean that people desire a return to it. In some respects, I think this is healthy. It's sort of an acknowledgement and an interest in that past. Because in the immediate period, there was a desire to reject it, or to ignore it, or to sidestep it. Plenty of people had big questions about the nation. I mean, I remember reading so many articles by Western European intellectuals and journalists, that were all afraid about nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And of course, in the former Yugoslavia, this ends up being a tremendous problem. The violent breakup of that state causes tremendous fissures and fractures and violence and ethnic cleansing. But by and large, I think the story looking back now has been a lot better than people may have thought. Much of the ethnic cleansing, as you know, of this region took place during and after World War II. But I'm happy to report that I think things are much better now. Just being in Poland this past couple of weeks and seeing the tremendous excitement about the new Polin Museum, the Museum of Polish, sort of the history of Polish Jews, being in Kazimierz, the sort of Jewish district of Krakow, you get the sense that these long and difficult issues are being dealt with much better now under the conditions of general security. So the characteristic goals. Democracy, transparency, respect for diversity, and a return to Europe. The characteristic results. Obviously, there has been economic growth. I think by 2012, the GDP per capita is 46% higher than it was in 1990 across the region. And this is including some of the former Soviet states as well in this figure. Consumption per household is 59% higher. Life expectancy in the region was 69 years, now it's 75, if I'm reading my own handwriting correctly. Maybe that's a 73. So I think in some of the measurable figures, there's no doubt that things are certainly better there now. In my own observation of going almost yearly for the last 15 years to Poland, and then just my memories of going pretty frequently in the 1990s. There are many more cars, there's much more advertising, but people that I know I see that they're materially better off. They're more secure. Even academics who in the early 2000s were scrambling by working 2 or 3 positions, for example, taking on weekend students and night students and doing consulting here and there. Now I see that they have greater sort of economic and job security in their sort of living conditions. And the friends with whom I stayed for the last few days that I was in Krakow are trying to sell their apartment that's too large. And they have 2 cars, and they're both academics, and they seem to have a very comfortable lifestyle. Now, of course, this is all relative, right? So there are certain groups who benefited much more from the transition. There's a generation now of people who are already in the workforce who never knew life under state socialism. And there's my generation who had their youth and their teens under state socialism, and then their kind of early adulthood under the sort of the free market. And then there are the elderly people, those people who may have worked in industrial jobs, and then those factories were not productive, they were closed. And for them, the transition was quite difficult and continues to be difficult. So the young urbanites and former communists have benefited most. This is hard for many people to take. I don't think it's quite as stark as it is in the former Soviet Union, where you have the rise of these oligarchs. But there's no doubt, even in places like Czech Republic, where there was a very deliberate effort to give shares in national companies to the people, people were ignorant of what that meant. And they were still incapable of holding on to them and keeping them for investment purposes, and they were still bought up by the savvy former managers, communist managers of these firms, who profiteered from the state's resources. So here's another Mleczko comic, and all it says is "dużo," a lot. And so you get the idea that for this woman, the transition means just that shopping, everyday existence is much more expensive. In the early period, the GDP in all of these states plummeted dramatically. They tried to implement what many call shock therapy. Of course, there were sort of fly-in Western economists, many of whom were absolutely convinced that their system was the way the world should be, and that if Eastern Europeans would merely adapt or adopt the market, that the market would resolve all problems. The results varied. In the period that I lived there, from 91 to 93, there was tremendous inflation. One of the stories some of you in this room have heard many times, for me, was just illustrated by the cost of 1 liter box of Donald Duck orange juice. The name is telling, I think. And when I arrived in September of 1991, that box cost 9,000 zloty, so there was already tremendous inflation and devaluation of the currency, so it cost 9,000 zloty. When I left in August of 1993, a box of Donald Duck orange juice cost 18,000 zloty. So it had doubled in cost in the 2 years that I was there. And for me, that was irrelevant, because I was a Polish millionaire when I would get my sort of monthly stipend. And the 9,000 zloty equaled $1 when I arrived, and 18,000 zloty equaled $1 when I left. And so the fact that I got my money that I had saved up, by the way, for my mission, it's not like I was working, but I had saved this money myself, my family and friends, to help me serve this mission. That money, it was completely the same for me, the cost of living. But certainly Poles' incomes didn't double in that period. And so there was tremendous inflation, and they faced this difficult prospect of having experienced in the 1980s extreme shortages in the stores, where you would stand in long lines, where you had to cultivate relationships with shop girls, where you had to barter, where you had to know the local drunk so that you could get the local drunk to give you his meat coupons, and you'd give him your alcohol coupons, so that you could sort of better provide for your family. So imagine this sort of living in the 80s, and in the 90s, everything is there in the stores, but you can't afford it. And it's hard to say what would be worse in terms of your mental health. So you have this period where there's tremendous inflation, everything becomes available, but ordinary people can't afford it. So they see it, but they can't have it. By 2000, however, living standards had caught up to pre-89 levels, and there was pretty dramatic growth of GDP annually. Not surprisingly, also, by the middle of the 1990s, many of our heroes here in the West, many of the dissidents, many of the intellectuals who entered politics, lost in the ballot booth. And I remember being crushed in 1995 that my hero, Lech Wałęsa, just lost to a former communist. And I thought, what is wrong here? And then, of course, I realized that this was a fair and free and open election, and that people wanted a social safety net, that the first 5 years of this shock therapy had been extremely difficult for ordinary people, and it made perfect sense that they would have elected someone who promised them more, to pay more attention to pensions and unemployment and state security, sort of social security sorts of issues. So these social democratic and left-wing coalitions tended to come into power by the mid-90s because of the difficulties of the transition period. Here's another cartoon. Sort of the new baby for the new year has one distinctive problem: the inflation. Here's some of the automobiles that one regularly saw from the state socialist era. The Wartburg was actually kind of a luxury high-end model, and the Trabant, I think, is sort of one that everyone connotes with Eastern Europe. Now if you go and take tours, you can drive around in these Trabants, right? And go see East Berlin or go see Nova Huta outside of Krakow. And here's an ad from the mid-2000s for the successful Czech auto company that's part of the Volkswagen Group, Škoda. And I just draw your attention to the language of the advertisement and what it's offering, sort of more room and comfort. And its appearance. I mean, this car looks like any other sort of modern European or sort of modern automobile. I remember when I was in Poland in the early 90s and just thinking it was so amazing to see all these cars that were just kind of flat tone colors, not metallic. So just yellow or whatever we would call that, harvest gold. Instead of the two-tone or fancy schmancy metallic color. All right, so I would say in terms of the issues of nationalism, there was definitely a continuation of the century of ethnic cleansing, but there's also room for much hope. Sort of the ways that Havel, for example, the very first person he invited to the castle, does anyone know? The very first official state visit to the castle in Prague? Yeah. Nope. Václav Havel becomes president. Very first person he invites, Frank Zappa. Yeah, Frank Zappa. The second person he invites is Richard von Weizsäcker, the president of Germany. And Havel relishes in the opportunity to play with metaphors in history, and he offers this speech where he says, the last time a German came to this castle, it was Hitler. He was seizing Prague, but you come in peace. I have tremendous respect for you. And there's no doubt that there's been a difficult past between Germans and Czechs, but let's let the historians do their work. Let's let them deal with the past honestly and fairly, and let's be sort of brother nations now. Let's get along. Let's do what we can. And Havel set the tone, and there have been scholarly articles that have shown that merely saying that and sort of trying to set that tone made a huge difference in the kind of scholarship that occurred about the Sudeten Germans and about the German occupation of Czechoslovakia during World War II. So I tend to be positive about the past, the way that historians in this region have dealt with and are dealing with the past. In terms of my theme about returning to Europe, sort of riding the bull into Europe, NATO integration in 1997 for many of these states, and then EU incorporation in 2004 and again in 2006 and 2007 for many of these states, has meant, in a very legitimate way, a return to Europe. There are still tremendous disparities between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I think Poland right now is per capita spending power GDP 67% of the EU average. So Poles are not as well off as Germans or the French, but they are continually improving. And the Polish economy was the only economy in Europe that had positive GDP throughout the Great Recession. None of the other including Germany, none of the other economies managed that feat. And I trust the knowledge in this room. Most of my experience is from Poland, but of course there's been stratification. Generally speaking, Central Europe has done better than Southeastern Europe. The Baltic states have done better in terms of the transition. So here we have the new EU member states. So by and large, I think we can say that where the reforms were rapid, where there was already a history of markets and parliamentary systems, the transition has been smoother than in places where it wasn't. Certainly individual leaders' choices have made a difference. The finance minister in Poland, I think, has done a very good job of sort of taking advantage of the fact that Poland is not on the euro, but gets EU funds. And I think that individual choices certainly have mattered. But I think that really there are some very strong historical legacies that have shaped the way that the transition has played out. So in terms of voting, for example, in Poland, people still tend to vote based on where the old partition boundaries were of Poland. So this was Galicia, this was Austria, very conservative, Catholic, and rural. This was Russian Poland, and this was Prussia, this was Prussian Poland, and this was just flat out part of the German Empire, right? And you see, even today, in voting results, that the loyalties tend to follow these boundaries from a century ago, right? And then, of course, there's this map that many of you have seen. Why can't I get to this? So how do I open that hyperlink using these?
You should be able to click on it on the slide.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a cursor, though.
Ah.
But if I just want to click on the legacies here, any ideas, any help? This seems so simple. But I don't see a cursor now. Oh, there it is. Okay, great, thanks. So many of you have seen this story from the priest shared it on the Facebook page. But basically, if you look at maps of Germany, it's also clear that the boundaries still matter, right? That it's a fascinating article. I highly recommend it. I love this map of the city where West Berlin uses, it's very hard to see in this lighting here and on this screen, but where West Berlin basically used a different kind of lighting, a much more eco-conscious sort of lighting. And so you can see from space where East Germany was and where the West German part of the city. So there are historical legacies that perhaps can go beyond just sort of choices. So, I talked a little bit about the nostalgia for the communist era, and I just want to underscore this point about how social and economic problems sometimes are due less to the recent policies and more to legacies of the previous regime, or even longer standing legacies, sort of just the agrarian, underdeveloped eastern part of Poland. Has a different experience of this transition than, say, someone who lives in Warsaw or Poznań. All right, so now I just want to talk a little bit about Poland in particular. I'm not going to go in great detail here. I've mentioned many of these things already. Here's another Mleczko cartoon about capitalism and socialism, and you get the sense that people sort of choose based on who they already are, the system that they might like better. Here is the Palace of Culture in Warsaw. For many Poles, this is, forgive me, it's going to be crude, but basically it's this from Stalin. It was a gift. There's a very similar building in Moscow, the university, right? And,
Several of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, 17.
And the Poles have long said that the best place to see Warsaw is from the top of this, because
You
Can't see it.
see it, right? You're in it. You can't see it. But I think over the last 25 years, they have sort of grown to accept this building. They put a clock on it, made it kind of like Big Ben. They light it up very nice at night with blues and yellows and golds and ambers. It is still the tallest building in Warsaw. But Warsaw is the Dallas of the East. This is a city with tremendous construction and growth. The constant building of new high-rise buildings. The Marriott was there when I arrived in '91, when I just was lonesome for a hamburger. I'd go there. This is a view that a photo I took from the Palace of Arts and Culture in the top, and you see just the spread of capitalism and sort of global popular culture. Johnny English and the Kia or Hyundai commercial there. This sort of wonderful modernist building, the PKO Bank, is now plastered with advertising. It sort of detracts from the clean lines of the designers. Here's a view again from the Palace of Arts and Culture, and this right here is the tower designed by Daniel Libeskind, who's of Polish Jewish heritage and who designed what's it called, the Freedom Tower in New York, sort of our commemoration for September 11th. And so there's this sort of soaring, twisting glass skyscraper. This is from 2011. There it is. So it's a high-rise apartment building for rich people. And it's not quite as tall as the Palace of Arts and Culture. And in every Polish city now, there are these glorious shopping malls. There's no doubt that capitalism is in place. When I lived there in 2011 with my family, we went and shopped very regularly at the Golden Terraces, Złote Tarasy shopping mall in downtown Warsaw, right in the shadow of the Palace of Arts and Culture. Here's Mleczko's take on it. Sort of this idea of sort of this global popular culture, this interest in yoga, but the thing that the guy wants to meditate for is money. Here is the market's invisible hand, and you go to your ATM and get jacked in the face. And here is Mleczko acknowledging that he has product placements, but he's making some suggestion about the ubiquity of the global market and sort of industrial sort of capitalism and corporate culture. And then here is a man in an insane asylum, and the sort of the assertion is that it was his work that got him there. He worked as a cashier at Biedronka, this sort of El Cheapo supermarket chain of stores. And you begin to see the point that was made earlier about proletarians of the world uniting. So here you have, again, someone who has a menial job to sort of slide things over a sensor as you make your purchases. I'm proud of this photograph. I took it myself. It was in the Ferrari dealership in Warsaw. It was about a half a block from the Fulbright offices. And does anyone know what used to inhabit this space? This was the Communist Party headquarters. Can't get more apt than that. So the Communist Party headquarters in Warsaw are now a place for the most rampant consumerism around. And I saw plenty of exotic cars as I rode my bicycle to and from the library in 2011 in Warsaw. In terms of the return to Europe, what has EU membership meant? Here's Muchko's wonderful take on that. Poland is exporting priests and importing Pride Parade participants. So this sort of skepticism about what does it mean to be part of the EU. There are two cows whose very bodies suggest their loyalties. Sort of a Polish nationalist perspective or a European perspective. And then here's one that's absolutely classic. So, criminals from Brussels, out with the European Union, only Poland, God, honor, fatherland, freedom and independence. And then right here on the sign says, this demonstration funded by funds from the EU. And there's no doubt that EU funds have made a tremendous difference in this part of the world. Every time I go back, there are new renovations that are taking place. I'm on the board of the City Historical Museum in Krakow, and they just opened a gorgeous new wing of the museum, and some of the funds came from the EU. When I go to Przemysl, the city that sort of this Austrian fortress city on the border now of Poland and Ukraine, it's beautiful because so much of the downtown has been renovated with EU funds. So I asked some of my friends while I was in Poland and in Prague, about what they think their world is like 25 years from now, 25 years after the fall. And one young Polish graduate student said, you know what has mattered most for me? The Erasmus program. The Erasmus program is this exchange program among European Union countries where students can go study, usually for a year in another city at another university. And he said, I still get together once a year with all my Erasmus buddies, and I feel European. We might go to Lisbon one year, we might go to Padua, we might go to Greece, we might go to Scotland, but we're all Europeans. And so for all of the skepticism and anger about monetary policy, about a lot of the problems with the EU, the sense that it could fracture, the sense that it could fall apart, this program seems to be a success. And these little placards that you see all over Eastern Europe, it's funny because people want to complain, particularly nationalists, but there are very clear benefits for belonging to the EU. This one is from the airport in Frankfurt a few years ago. Absolutely delightful. This idea of a father-in-law figure with his cufflinks and his tie and his very stern look, sitting in front of his fireplace. Why didn't you invest in Eastern Poland? It's catering to a very particular audience, right? Someone who has money to invest. But again, the suggestion that there's growth, that there's possibility, that there are markets, and that EU funding and that personal and business funding and individual investments can make a difference. Just this past week, I read a newspaper article that demographic growth, childbirth rates are up in Poland. They're very happy about that. This poster shows that Poland is one of 4 countries where there is the most projected construction growth in the next several years. So clearly, there's a lot of sort of change and a lot of things to be positive about. But I want to go back to one more thing, and let's skip right here. So I was in Poland for the anniversary that matters more to them. The Berlin Wall matters less. I mean, obviously people were interested in it. But their anniversary is June 4th, right? That's when the communists were voted out of power in the first free, fair elections. And the commemoration in 2009, the 20th anniversary rather than the 25th, took place in two places because of the division in the Polish government between the conservative right-wing party PIS and the Citizens Party. And in Krakow, I was really excited that I was going to be there on this momentous day. And it turns out that Havel and Wałęsa and Merkel made us, I think, a really stupid mistake. They went to Wawel Castle and sort of patted each other's backs and cheered about what they had done 20 years before, instead of doing something public with the people. I mean, that's how these revolutions occurred, was people power. So they sat up in Wawel Castle. I didn't get to do anything, so I went out for lunch from the archives, and this is what I saw: a protest rally taking place. There was the People's Republic of Poland, there is the Republic of Poland, but the battle has not finished. And then these middle-aged women with a poster saying, "We have the freedom to die of hunger without a roof over our head." So the limits of the transition, there's no doubt that overall people are better off. There's no doubt that there are more cars and there's more advertising, that the standard of living has risen. But there are still people who feel left behind. So I think that's what is important for us to remember, is that if we look at statistics, if we look at lots of numbers, they can tell us, I think, a great deal. Particularly if we look at the national scale, they also can obscure. So certain generations have fared much better. Certain groups have fared much better. Certain countries or parts of countries, as that map of Poland shows you, have fared differently. All in all, I think what we learn from this is that the legacies of history sometimes are quite long-standing. I think the trajectory is there. When I talked to my sociologist friends in Poland over dinner last Sunday night, I said, "Guys, I'm giving a talk next week. I don't want to look like a fool. Tell me what you think. What would you say?" And as I listened to them talk about all the changes that they've witnessed in the last 25 years and what they see as the problems in the future, part of me was optimistic that the problems that they see in the future, now mind you, this is a particular demographic group, right? These are people who study society, but they themselves are comfortable academics. And they said that what they see as their problems are growing economic inequality and environmental degradation and the power of international corporations. In other words, the problems that I think we all face today. So maybe that's a triumph. It's still depressing, but maybe that's a triumph that now we can say that 25 years on, East Central Europe is normal. And that normal isn't necessarily a great thing, but it's better than it was before. And many of the problems that they face are similar to the problems that I think we all face. And so there you go. That's my talk. I look forward to your sort of questions and comments and what you probably know much better than I do.